Ethan Carter lost his job in less than 30 seconds, and the woman who fired him had no idea what had happened during the previous 48 hours. The Security Operations Center on the 23rd floor was usually alive with glowing monitors, quiet conversations, and the constant hum of servers protecting billions of dollars in digital assets. But at 6:17 on a rainy Thursday morning, the room felt strangely still. Ethan sat in front of 6 screens, his head tilted forward, his eyes closed. To anyone walking past the glass walls, it looked obvious. He was asleep. Victoria Reynolds, the newly appointed CEO of Sentinel Dynamics, stopped in the hallway and stared through the glass. Her expression hardened immediately. She had spent the last 6 months trying to reshape the company culture. Efficiency, accountability, excellence. Those words appeared in every executive meeting and every company memo. Nothing frustrated her more than employees who failed to take responsibility. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Several analysts looked up nervously. The room became silent. Victoria walked directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter." No response. "Mr. Carter." Still nothing. She folded her arms. Unbelievable. The analysts exchanged uneasy glances. One of them opened his mouth as if he wanted to explain something, then quickly stopped. Ethan finally stirred when Victoria's voice rose slightly. He blinked against the harsh monitor light and slowly sat upright. For a brief moment, he looked disoriented. Not guilty, not embarrassed, just exhausted. Victoria did not notice the difference. "You were sleeping during an active shift?" she asked sharply. Ethan looked at her, then at the surrounding employees. The room felt heavier with every second. "I can explain," one analyst said quietly. Victoria raised a hand. "I did not ask you." Ethan rubbed his eyes once and straightened in his chair. Dark circles sat beneath them like shadows. His face looked pale, older than his 42 years. Victoria interpreted it as neglect. Weakness. A lack of discipline. "This company cannot afford people who treat critical responsibilities like nap time," she said. Ethan remained silent. Around them, dozens of monitors displayed scrolling lines of information. Alerts flashed. Data moved continuously. Yet nobody paid attention to the screens anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on the confrontation unfolding in front of them. "You are terminated effective immediately," Victoria said. The words landed with shocking speed. Several employees visibly froze. Ethan simply looked at her. For a moment, it seemed as though he might argue, explain, defend himself. Instead, he slowly nodded. Understood. That answer somehow irritated Victoria even more. There was no protest, no pleading, no attempt to save his position. Just acceptance. Quiet acceptance. Ethan stood, removed his access badge, and placed it carefully on the desk. The plastic card made a soft clicking sound against the surface. In the silence that followed, it sounded surprisingly loud. Outside the building, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, something felt wrong, though nobody could yet explain why. Ethan walked toward his locker without speaking. The analysts watched him leave. One young employee finally turned toward Victoria. "Ma'am, maybe you should know that the decision is final," she interrupted. Her voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The analyst lowered his eyes and said nothing else. 40 minutes later, Ethan exited the building carrying a small cardboard box. A framed photograph rested on top. The image showed him standing beside a smiling 11-year-old girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin. Lily Carter, the center of his world. His daughter, the reason he worked every holiday, every overnight shift, and every weekend emergency. Ethan paused beneath the building awning as rain drifted across the city streets. For the first time all morning, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily appeared on the screen. "Good luck today, Dad. Love you." Ethan smiled despite everything. A small, tired smile. Then he placed the phone back into his pocket and walked toward his aging pickup truck. High above him, hidden behind layers of steel, glass, and encrypted systems, hundreds of servers continued operating without interruption. The company appeared perfectly secure, perfectly stable, perfectly protected. Yet inside a restricted section of the network, warning logs quietly accumulated. Unread, unnoticed, waiting. And as Ethan drove away through the rain, nobody inside Sentinel Dynamics realized that the most dangerous part of the story had not started when he fell asleep. It had started long before that. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan Carter pulled into the driveway of his small white house on the edge of Charlotte. The clouds were beginning to break apart, allowing thin beams of sunlight to reach the wet pavement. Normally, he would sit in the truck for a few moments before going inside, using the quiet to separate work from home. Today, he remained there longer than usual. The cardboard box rested on the passenger seat beside him. The access badge was gone. The job was gone. Yet strangely, that was not what occupied his thoughts. His eyes drifted toward the dashboard clock. Every passing minute made him wonder what was happening back at Sentinel Dynamics. Not because he missed the office, because he knew things nobody else knew. Finally, the front door burst open before he could gather himself. Lily Carter raced across the yard wearing a bright yellow sweatshirt and sneakers that were still untied. "Dad," she shouted. Ethan stepped out just in time to catch her as she wrapped her arms around him. Her energy felt like sunlight after a storm. "You are home early," she said. Ethan smiled carefully. "Looks that way." Lily studied him. At 11 years old, she possessed an unusual ability to notice things adults tried to hide. Something happened. It was not a question. Ethan laughed softly. "You are getting too good at this." Together they walked inside. The house was modest but warm. Family photographs lined the walls. School drawings hung on the refrigerator. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive, yet it felt like home in a way no corporate office ever could. Ethan placed the cardboard box near the kitchen table. Lily immediately noticed the framed photograph resting on top. "Did you leave your desk?" Ethan paused. Children often ask the hardest questions with the fewest words. Something like that. Lily lowered her voice. "Did they fire you?" Ethan looked at her. Then he nodded. The room fell quiet. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to react. Angry? Sad? Afraid? Eventually, she chose honesty. "That is stupid." Ethan laughed despite himself. "Maybe. Not maybe." She crossed her arms. "Definitely." The certainty in her voice almost made him smile wider. Almost. Later that evening, after Lily finished her homework, Ethan sat alone on the back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. The neighborhood felt peaceful. Distant lawn mowers hummed. Dogs barked occasionally. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary evening. Yet inside his mind, nothing felt ordinary. His phone remained silent. No calls from coworkers. No messages from management. No requests for help. Part of him expected that. Another part found it unsettling. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, the atmosphere inside Sentinel Dynamics had begun to shift. At first, the changes were subtle. Easy to dismiss. A delayed security report. An unusual network alert. Minor anomalies appearing in system logs. The kind of issues that happened every day inside large technology companies. Yet several analysts noticed something strange. The alerts kept returning. Daniel Brooks, the company's chief technology officer, stared at a monitoring screen displaying hundreds of security notifications. Something felt off. He could not explain why. The patterns looked familiar, but not familiar enough. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Has anyone reviewed these?" he asked. One analyst hesitated. Ethan usually handled this category. The room grew uncomfortable. Nobody said his name very often anymore. Not after that morning. Daniel frowned and returned his attention to the screen. "Then who is handling it now?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence told him everything. Elsewhere in the building, Victoria Reynolds continued moving through meetings with her usual confidence. Financial forecasts, executive briefings, investor updates. The schedule remained relentless. Yet small interruptions kept appearing throughout the day. Questions from technical departments. Requests for additional reviews. Concerns about unusual network activity. Nothing alarming. Not yet. Still, she found the timing irritating. Late that night, long after most employees had gone home, a junior analyst remained seated in the Security Operations Center, the same room where Ethan had been fired. He studied a collection of system logs and felt a growing sense of confusion. Several entries appeared incomplete. Others seemed connected to processes no longer running. Most unusual of all, a long series of security tasks simply stopped at exactly the same time Ethan's account had been disabled. The analyst stared at the screen. Then he opened another report. Then another. Slowly, his concern deepened. Back at home, Ethan finally prepared for bed. Exhaustion pulled at him from every direction. He had barely slept during the previous several days. Even Lily had noticed. Before turning off the light, He checked his phone one last time. Still nothing. He placed it on the nightstand and closed his eyes. For the first time in nearly 48 hours, there was no emergency call waiting, no warning alarm, no flashing alert demanding his attention. The silence should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt incomplete. Across the city, hidden behind millions of lines of code and layers of digital infrastructure, something continued moving quietly through the darkness. Most people could not see it. Most people did not even know it existed. But somewhere deep inside Sentinel Dynamics, a problem Ethan had spent days trying to contain was beginning to move again. And this time, nobody seemed to be watching. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and an uncomfortable sense of calm. Ethan Carter stood in the kitchen making pancakes while Lily sat at the counter working on a school project. To anyone looking through the window, they appeared like any ordinary family enjoying a quiet weekend. Yet beneath the surface, both were carrying concerns they rarely spoke aloud. Lily worried about money. Ethan worried about everything else. He smiled when she laughed. He listened when she talked about school. He helped her cut pictures for a science presentation. But every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the phone resting silently on the counter. He hated that habit. He hated that part of him still felt connected to a company that had already moved on without him. Across the city, Sentinel Dynamics was beginning to discover how much one person could matter. The Security Operations Center looked different now. Not physically. The same monitors covered the walls. The same rows of workstations filled the room. Yet an invisible tension had settled over the department. Alerts that were once routine now seemed harder to interpret. Patterns that normally made sense suddenly felt incomplete. Daniel Brooks spent most of Saturday reviewing reports from the previous week. The deeper he looked, the more frustrated he became. Several ongoing investigations lacked final documentation. Automated response systems appeared partially modified. Entire chains of activity seemed connected to tasks nobody could fully explain. Every road eventually led back to the same name. Ethan Carter. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "What exactly were you working on?" he muttered. No one had an answer. By late afternoon, another problem emerged. A regional server cluster experienced unusual activity. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing visible to customers. Yet the event triggered a sequence of internal warnings that demanded immediate review. Analysts gathered around monitoring screens while engineers searched for explanations. One alert became 3. 3 became 7. Soon dozens of notifications appeared across multiple systems. The room remained calm, but only on the surface. Beneath the professionalism, concern was growing rapidly. Daniel walked into the operations center and studied the screens. "Talk to me." An analyst pointed toward a dashboard. "The traffic patterns are wrong." Daniel frowned. "Wrong how?" The analyst hesitated. "They look familiar." "From where?" The young man swallowed hard. "From the reports Ethan was reviewing before he left." Silence settled across the room. Nobody liked where that answer was leading. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds spent her Saturday attending a leadership retreat organized months earlier. Executive speakers discussed innovation, growth, and corporate strategy. The conference center overlooked a beautiful lake. Expensive suits filled the room. Polished presentations occupied giant screens. Yet Victoria found herself increasingly distracted. Her phone continued vibrating with updates from headquarters. Nothing urgent enough to require her immediate return. Still, the interruptions were becoming difficult to ignore. During a break, she stepped outside onto a wooden terrace overlooking the water. Her chief assistant approached carrying a tablet. "Another update from technology operations." Victoria sighed. "What now?" "They are investigating unusual network behavior." Victoria rubbed her temples. "Again?" The assistant nodded. "Daniel seems concerned." Victoria stared across the lake. For the first time, a small seed of doubt began to form. Not about the technology. About the timing. Back in Charlotte, Ethan finally stopped checking his phone. By evening, he had convinced himself that Sentinel Dynamics was no longer his responsibility. He grilled hamburgers for dinner. He helped Lily practice a presentation she would give next week. Later, they watched an old movie together on the couch. For a few precious hours, life felt normal. Then shortly before midnight, his phone buzzed. Ethan glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed a familiar number. Sentinel Dynamics. He stared at it without answering. The ringing stopped. A minute later, another call arrived. Then another. Ethan remained still. Lily had already fallen asleep nearby. He looked at her peaceful expression and chose silence. Whatever was happening at the company was no longer his burden to carry. Yet sleep did not come easily that night. Something felt wrong. Deep down, he sensed it. The same instinct that had kept him awake for nearly 2 days before his termination refused to disappear. At Sentinel Dynamics, the situation continued escalating. More alerts appeared. More systems reported unusual activity. Engineers worked through the night attempting to isolate the source. Every hour produced additional questions. Very few answers. Shortly after 2 in the morning, Daniel finally discovered something hidden inside a collection of archived logs. His expression changed instantly. He opened another file. Then another. The timestamps stretched backward nearly 48 hours. Hundreds of actions. Thousands of responses. Layer after layer of activity buried beneath ordinary system operations. Daniel stared at the screen in disbelief. The room around him seemed to disappear. For the first time, he realized Ethan had not simply been working before he was fired. He had been fighting something. Something enormous. Something nobody else had fully seen. And as the clock continued ticking toward dawn, Daniel understood one terrifying truth. Whatever Ethan had been trying to stop was not gone. It was still there. Sunday morning arrived without answers. Daniel Brooks had not gone home. Empty coffee cups surrounded his workstation, and the glow of monitoring screens reflected in his tired eyes. For hours he had been digging through archived logs, tracing events backward through the previous week. The deeper he searched, the more uncomfortable he became. Ethan Carter's name appeared everywhere. Not in obvious ways. Not in reports sent to executives. Not in public summaries. It appeared buried inside emergency responses, custom security rules, and manually executed commands that seemed to connect dozens of unrelated incidents into a single hidden pattern. Daniel opened another record and froze. The timestamp showed 3 o'clock in the morning 2 days earlier. Ethan had already completed a 12-hour shift. Yet according to the logs, he was still working. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. The activity never stopped. Daniel leaned forward. That is impossible. But it was not impossible. The evidence sat directly in front of him. Across the operations center, engineers continued monitoring unusual network behavior. Every few minutes another alert appeared. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing public. Yet the volume continued increasing. The company remained protected, but nobody could explain why certain defenses were holding when others should have failed hours earlier. Shortly after 9 in the morning, Victoria Reynolds returned to headquarters. She entered the executive floor expecting updates and solutions. Instead, she found anxiety. Managers who normally projected confidence now spoke cautiously. Technical teams requested emergency reviews. Meetings were being rescheduled. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. Victoria walked directly into the technology command room. Tell me what is happening. Daniel looked up from his screen. His face revealed exhaustion. We have a problem. What kind of problem? The kind we do not fully understand yet. Victoria folded her arms. That is not an answer. Daniel hesitated. Then he turned his monitor toward her. Hundreds of entries filled the display. Complex system actions. Emergency responses. Security adjustments. Victoria studied the information without understanding most of the technical details. What am I looking at? Daniel exhaled slowly. I think Ethan was handling something much bigger than we realized. The room became quiet. Victoria's expression hardened immediately. Are we seriously discussing him again? We need to. Daniel pointed at the screen. These records show nearly 48 consecutive hours of activity. 48 hours. Without meaningful breaks. Victoria looked unconvinced. People exaggerate. Daniel shook his head. Computers do not. That answer lingered in the room longer than either expected. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the morning helping Lily prepare for school. They organized notebooks, packed lunches, and reviewed a presentation she would give later in the week. For the first time since losing his job, he seemed slightly more relaxed. Not happy, just present. Lily noticed it immediately. You smiled more today. Ethan laughed softly. Was I keeping score? I was. She grinned. You should do it more. Ethan reached over and gently tapped her shoulder. Moments like these reminded him why he endured long nights and impossible schedules. Why he accepted pressure that most people never saw. Why he kept going when exhaustion told him to stop. Yet even there, in the comfort of home, uncertainty remained. Bills would still arrive. Responsibilities would not disappear. His savings could help for a while, but not forever. The future suddenly felt less predictable than it had a week earlier. Back at Sentinel Dynamics, Robert Hayes joined Daniel in reviewing the logs. Unlike many executives, Robert had worked alongside technical teams for years. He understood enough to recognize when something was unusual. After 30 minutes, his expression changed. Then it changed again. Finally, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling. "Good Lord." Daniel nodded slowly. "You see it too." Robert pointed toward a timeline displayed on the monitor. "Look at these hours. Thousands of actions stretched across nearly 2 days. Security patches, threat analysis, containment procedures, emergency routing decisions. Each one executed by Ethan. Each one occurring while most of the company slept." Robert rubbed his forehead. "Nobody does this alone." Daniel did not answer immediately, because the evidence suggested exactly that. As afternoon approached, another discovery emerged. Buried inside one of Ethan's private work folders sat a collection of notes. Not reports prepared for recognition. Not messages seeking praise. Just detailed observations written for whoever might need them next. Daniel opened the first document, then the second, then the third. With every page, the silence inside the room deepened. Whatever Ethan had been facing, he had known it was serious. Serious enough to document everything. Serious enough to prepare for the possibility that someone else might have to continue the fight. And for the first time since Ethan walked out carrying that small cardboard box, Victoria Reynolds began to feel something she had not experienced since becoming CEO. Doubt. Monday arrived carrying a tension that nobody inside Sentinel Dynamics could ignore anymore. Employees who normally began their week discussing projects and deadlines now spoke in lowered voices. Rumors moved through hallways faster than official updates. The technology division had spent nearly 2 full days chasing a problem they still could not fully define. Every investigation uncovered another layer. Every answer produced 2 new questions. And at the center of everything stood a man who was no longer there. Daniel Brooks entered the operations center before sunrise. Most of the night shift was still present. Nobody looked rested. Multiple screens displayed threat maps, activity reports, and security dashboards filled with unusual patterns. The situation remained contained, but only barely. Daniel placed a stack of printed reports on the table. "I want every event from the last 72 hours reviewed again." One analyst looked up. "Again?" Daniel nodded. "Especially anything connected to Ethan." Nobody argued. They had all seen enough by now to understand that his name was not appearing by coincidence. Several hours later, the investigation reached a turning point. Robert Hayes arrived carrying additional records recovered from archived storage. Together, he and Daniel began reconstructing a timeline of events. What emerged was startling. 48 hours before Ethan had been fired, unusual network traffic had begun flowing toward the company's systems. At first it appeared harmless. Then it multiplied. Then it adapted. Then it changed direction entirely. Layer after layer of defensive responses appeared throughout the records. Each one carefully placed. Each one executed by Ethan. Victoria Reynolds sat silently as the findings were presented. The conference room felt colder than usual. Large windows overlooked the city skyline, but nobody paid attention to the view. "How extensive was it?" she asked. Daniel exchanged a glance with Robert. Neither man seemed eager to answer. Finally, Robert spoke. "Bigger than anything we initially realized." Victoria frowned. "Define bigger." Daniel turned his laptop toward her. Graphs covered the display. Activity levels surged upward like mountains. Tens of thousands of automated attempts. Then hundreds of thousands. Then millions. The numbers continued climbing. Victoria stared at the screen. "Are you telling me this was all happening before Friday?" "Yes." "And Ethan was handling it?" Another silence followed. Daniel finally answered. Mostly by himself. The words landed heavily. Around the table, executives shifted uneasily in their seats. Several people avoided eye contact entirely. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had nobody known? The answer emerged gradually through Ethan's notes. He had deliberately shielded other departments from unnecessary panic while investigating the source. He had documented every step, every concern, every recommendation. But the reports were technical, buried within internal systems that few executives regularly reviewed. He had done what he always did. solved problems quietly, protected people quietly, carried responsibility quietly. The same qualities that made him effective had also made him invisible. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the morning searching online job listings while Lily attended school. The routine felt strange. For years, his schedule had revolved around emergency calls, overnight alerts, and constant responsibility. Now the silence felt almost unnatural. Yet despite everything, he refused to complain. He updated his resume, answered a few emails, made coffee. The ordinary rhythm of life continued. Around noon, his phone buzzed again. Another call from Sentinel Dynamics. Ethan stared at the screen. This time he let it ring until voicemail picked up. A few moments later, a message arrived. Please call when available. Important. Ethan read the message twice. Then he locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. Some wounds needed time before conversation could begin. Back at headquarters, pressure continued building. Investors had started asking questions about unusual delays in several internal systems. Technical teams were working around the clock. Security specialists from outside consulting firms had been contacted for assistance. Yet every expert who reviewed the situation reached a similar conclusion. Whoever had designed the current protective measures possessed extraordinary knowledge of the company's infrastructure. One consultant examined Ethan's work for nearly an hour before speaking. Who built these layers? Daniel answered quietly. One of our former employees. The consultant raised an eyebrow. Former. He was terminated Friday morning. The consultant looked genuinely confused. Why? No one answered immediately. Because the truth sounded increasingly difficult to defend. Late that afternoon, another hidden folder was discovered among Ethan's archived files. Unlike the previous notes, these documents contained predictions, risk assessments, future scenarios, potential outcomes. Daniel opened the first file and felt his stomach tighten. Many of the issues currently appearing across the network had been anticipated days earlier. Ethan had seen them coming. He had written detailed warnings, detailed solutions, detailed contingency plans. The date at the top of the document was Thursday night, less than 12 hours before he had been found asleep at his workstation. As the realization spread through the room, nobody spoke for several moments. Outside, clouds gathered once again above the city. Inside Sentinel Dynamics, the growing crisis was no longer centered on what was happening inside the network. It was centered on a much harder question. How much had Ethan Carter actually prevented before anyone noticed he was gone? Tuesday morning began with a meeting nobody wanted to attend. The executive conference room at Sentinel Dynamics was filled long before sunrise. Coffee sat untouched. Presentation screens glowed quietly against the walls. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, a growing realization was beginning to settle over everyone present. Daniel Brooks stood at the front of the room, holding a remote control. He looked exhausted, but there was something else in his expression now. Conviction. For 2 days he had followed the evidence wherever it led, and every path pointed in the same direction. He pressed a button. A timeline appeared on the screen. Thousands of entries stretched across nearly 50 hours. Security responses, defensive measures, system recoveries, emergency adjustments. Everything you see here was performed by Ethan Carter, Daniel said quietly. No one interrupted. Most of it happened during a period when he should have been off duty. Another slide appeared, then another. The room grew quieter with each one. Victoria Reynolds sat motionless. Her usual confidence had begun to erode. She had spent years building a reputation for decisive leadership, quick judgment, strong action. Yet now she found herself staring at evidence that challenged every assumption she had made on Friday morning. Daniel clicked again. These are the threats he documented. The screen filled with reports. Hundreds of pages. Carefully organized. Carefully detailed. Not written for recognition. Written for protection. Written because someone needed to know. Robert Hayes leaned forward. How many people knew he was handling this? Daniel answered without hesitation. Almost nobody. A long silence followed. Finally, one executive shook his head. Why would he keep this to himself? Daniel thought about that question. Then he answered honestly. Because solving the problem mattered more to him than getting credit for solving it. The room became even quieter. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Carter sat inside a small diner near his neighborhood. His laptop was open. A notebook rested beside his coffee. He had spent the morning reviewing job listings and updating technical certifications. The process felt strange. For years, his entire professional identity had been connected to protecting systems few people ever noticed. Now he was introducing himself to potential employers as if none of that history existed. The waitress approached his table. "Refill." Ethan smiled. "Please." She filled the cup and hesitated. "You look like someone carrying a lot." Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe a little." She nodded knowingly and moved on. Sometimes strangers understood more than friends. Back at Sentinel Dynamics, the investigation continued. Another discovery emerged shortly before noon. Hidden within Ethan's archive communications was a sequence of messages sent during the previous week. Not to executives, not to management, to technical teams. Warnings, recommendations, requests for additional support. Several had gone unanswered. Others had been delayed. Some had never reached the appropriate departments at all. Daniel reviewed the chain twice. Then a third time. The picture becoming visible was deeply uncomfortable. Ethan had not worked alone because he preferred isolation. He had worked alone because help had never fully arrived. Victoria stared at the messages in silence. One particular note caught her attention. The language was calm, professional, respectful. Yet beneath the restraint, she could see the urgency. Ethan had known something serious was unfolding. He had been trying to prepare the organization. No accusations, no complaints, just facts, quiet facts, the kind that became impossible to ignore once they were finally understood. Throughout the afternoon, outside consultants continued analyzing the situation. Their conclusions were remarkably consistent. Whoever had built the current defensive framework possessed exceptional skill. Several layers were so customized that outside specialists needed hours simply to understand how they functioned. One consultant finally looked up from his workstation. "This is unusual." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How unusual?" The man pointed toward the screen. "Most people build defenses to stop known threats." He paused. Whoever designed this built defenses against threats that had not happened yet. Nobody spoke for several seconds, because they all understood what that meant. Ethan had not merely been reacting. He had been anticipating, predicting, preparing. Late that evening, Victoria found herself standing alone inside the Security Operations Center. The room looked almost identical to the morning she had fired Ethan. The same monitors, the same lighting, the same chair where he had fallen asleep. Yet everything felt different now. She walked slowly toward the workstation. His desk had already been cleared. Only a faint outline remained where personal items once sat. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she noticed something attached beneath one monitor. A small handwritten note. Nothing dramatic. Nothing important to anyone else. Just a reminder written in Ethan's careful handwriting. "Verify before assuming." Victoria stared at those 3 words. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet they landed harder than any accusation could have. Because for the first time since Friday morning, she began to understand that the greatest mistake might not have been firing Ethan Carter. The greatest mistake might have been never truly seeing him at all. And somewhere deep within the company network, the problem Ethan had spent nearly 2 days containing continued testing every barrier he had left behind, as though waiting to discover whether the man who built them would ever return. Wednesday morning brought something far more dangerous than technical problems. It brought certainty. For days, the leadership team at Sentinel Dynamics had been chasing fragments of a story they did not fully understand. Now those fragments were beginning to connect. Every recovered file, every archived log, every overlooked report pointed toward the same conclusion. Ethan Carter had been carrying a burden far larger than anyone had realized. Daniel Brooks sat alone inside a secure conference room, reviewing one final collection of records recovered from backup servers. The files had been difficult to locate because they were never intended to attract attention. They were stored deep inside internal archives under ordinary labels. The kind of place where only someone looking very carefully would ever think to search. Daniel opened the first document. Then another. Then another. By the 4th file, he stopped reading and simply stared at the screen. The timestamps stretched across nearly 2 days. Detailed observations, threat assessments, recovery procedures. Every entry written by Ethan. Every entry becoming more urgent than the one before it. Yet what captured Daniel's attention was not the technical information. It was the tone. There was no panic, no frustration, no blame. Just responsibility. Quiet responsibility. The kind carried by someone who understood exactly what was at stake. An hour later, Daniel called an emergency meeting. Victoria Reynolds arrived first. Robert Hayes followed moments later. Neither looked well rested. The previous week seemed to have aged everyone inside the company. Daniel connected his laptop to the display screen. "You need to see this." The room darkened as the presentation appeared. Hundreds of entries filled the screen. At first glance, they looked like ordinary technical notes. Then Daniel zoomed in on the timestamps. Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening, Thursday night, Friday morning, hour after hour. Activity never stopped. Victoria leaned forward. "He never left?" Daniel shook his head. "Not according to the records." Robert frowned. "That cannot be healthy." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It was not." Another slide appeared. This one contained access records. Security responses. Emergency actions executed throughout the night. The volume was staggering. Several executives who had joined remotely sat speechless. One finally broke the silence. Why was nobody helping him? No one answered immediately. Because nobody liked the answer. Many people had assumed someone else was handling the situation. Others never understood how serious it was becoming. A few simply trusted that Ethan would manage it because he always did. Somewhere along the way, competence had become invisible. Reliability had become expected. Sacrifice had become normal. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan walked into Lily's school auditorium. Parents were gathering for a student presentation event. Folding chairs filled the room. Teachers greeted families near the entrance. For the first time in days, Ethan looked genuinely relaxed. Lily spotted him from across the room and waved enthusiastically. He waved back. Nothing about the moment felt extraordinary. Yet perhaps that was exactly what made it meaningful. While executives and specialists chased crises inside glass towers, Ethan sat proudly in a folding chair watching his daughter explain a science project. The contrast could not have been greater. One world measured value through performance reports and financial outcomes. The other measured value through presence, through showing up, through love. Back at Sentinel Dynamics, the meeting continued. Daniel opened one final folder. "This is what I found last night." The screen displayed a sequence of recorded observations written during the final hours before Ethan's termination. The room fell silent. Victoria read each line carefully. Ethan had documented unusual behavior spreading through multiple systems. He had identified potential vulnerabilities, proposed containment strategies, listed emergency actions if conditions worsened. Everything was there. Every warning, every recommendation. Then Victoria noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The final entry carried a timestamp only 3 hours before she had walked into the operations center and found him asleep. She stared at the words. The room seemed to disappear around her. 3 hours. 3 hours earlier, he had still been actively protecting the company. 3 hours earlier, he had still been working. 3 hours earlier, he had still been trying to stop something no one else fully understood. Robert exhaled slowly. Good Lord. Nobody disagreed. Late that afternoon, outside consultants completed another review of the company's defensive systems. Their findings arrived in a formal report. Daniel read the executive summary twice. Then a third time. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. Several critical protections currently preventing widespread disruption depended entirely on custom frameworks Ethan had personally created. Frameworks nobody else fully understood yet. Frameworks still holding the line. For the first time, the problem facing Sentinel Dynamics was no longer theoretical. It was personal. The company had not simply lost an employee. It had lost the one person who knew every corner of the battlefield. As evening settled over Charlotte, Victoria remained alone in her office long after everyone else had left. The city lights glowed beyond the glass walls. Rain began falling softly against the windows. She looked once more at Ethan's final reports, then at the handwritten note recovered from his workstation. Verify before assuming. The words echoed in her mind. And for the first time since Friday morning, she stopped thinking about what Ethan had done. She started thinking about what he had endured. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was helping Lily finish homework and prepare for another school day. He had no idea that inside Sentinel Dynamics, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. And he certainly had no idea that before the week was over, the people who had overlooked him would be forced to confront a reality far bigger than any of them were prepared to face. Thursday arrived carrying the kind of pressure that could no longer be hidden behind conference room doors or technical language. For nearly a week, Sentinel Dynamics had been balancing on foundations built by a man they had dismissed in less than a minute. Now those foundations were being tested harder than ever. The Security Operations Center remained active around the clock. Analysts rotated through shifts. Engineers slept in empty offices. Consultants joined emergency calls from different parts of the country. Yet despite all the effort, one uncomfortable truth remained unchanged. Everyone was still following a path Ethan Carter had created. Daniel Brooks stood before a wall of monitors watching another wave of unusual activity spread across the network. The systems were holding. Barely. Every hour seemed to introduce a new challenge. Every challenge seemed connected to something Ethan had anticipated days earlier. The realization had stopped feeling surprising. It now felt haunting. Robert Hayes entered carrying a fresh report from the consulting team. He placed it on the desk without speaking. Daniel opened the document and immediately frowned. This cannot be right. Robert nodded slowly. That was my reaction too. The report detailed dozens of defensive mechanisms still protecting critical infrastructure. Each one traced back to Ethan's work. Some had been created months earlier. Others appeared to have been modified only days before his termination. Several specialists had reached the same conclusion. If those protections had not existed, the company would already be facing consequences far beyond internal disruptions. Daniel looked around the room. Nobody seemed relieved. If anything, the report made everyone more uneasy, because it revealed not only what Ethan had accomplished, it revealed how close the company had come to discovering it too late. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan spent the afternoon helping Lily prepare for a school field trip. Permission slips covered the kitchen table. Lunch plans were discussed. Simple conversations filled the house. Yet beneath the ordinary routine, uncertainty lingered. Another voicemail from Sentinel Dynamics sat unanswered on his phone. Then another. Then another. He listened to none of them. Not out of anger. Not even out of pride. He simply did not know what remained to be said. The company had made its decision. He had accepted it. Sometimes dignity meant walking away quietly. Lily noticed the phone vibrating again. That place keeps calling. Ethan smiled faintly. Apparently. Are you going to answer? He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he locked it. Not today. Lily nodded. Somehow she understood. Back at headquarters, Victoria Reynolds sat alone reviewing Ethan's personnel file. It was something she should have done months earlier. Perhaps years earlier if she had been there that long. Performance reviews. Project evaluations. Internal commendations. The documents painted a picture she had never taken time to see. Consistent excellence. Exceptional reliability. Quiet leadership. Again and again, managers praised his ability to solve problems without creating noise. One review contained a sentence she read 3 separate times. Ethan is the person we call when nobody else knows what to do. Victoria stared at those words. Then she closed her eyes. The memory of Friday morning returned with painful clarity. The glass walls. The sleeping man. Her certainty. His silence. For the first time, she wondered how exhausted he must have been standing there while she delivered her judgment. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. Deeply tired. Late that afternoon, another discovery emerged from the archived records. Daniel had been reviewing server activity when he noticed an unusual sequence buried within Ethan's final hours on duty. He followed the trail carefully. One file led to another, then another. Eventually, he reached a protected folder containing detailed incident logs from the night before Ethan was fired. The room fell silent as he began reading. The timeline revealed an escalating battle against increasingly sophisticated threats. Every response documented. Every decision recorded. Every action justified. The deeper Daniel looked, the more astonishing the picture became. Ethan had not been reacting to isolated problems. He had been managing a coordinated crisis unfolding across multiple systems simultaneously. A crisis most employees never even knew existed. By evening, the leadership team gathered once more. Nobody argued. Nobody deflected responsibility. The evidence had grown too overwhelming. Victoria listened quietly as the findings were presented. Her expression revealed none of the authority that had defined her earlier in the week. Only reflection. Only regret. Only the slow realization that some mistakes cannot be undone simply by acknowledging them. Then Daniel revealed one final detail. The last major defensive update Ethan implemented had occurred less than 4 hours before he was found asleep at his desk. For hours, the room went completely silent. Outside, darkness settled across the city. Inside Sentinel Dynamics, no one spoke for several moments, because everyone understood what that meant. Ethan had not fallen asleep because he did not care. He had fallen asleep after carrying a responsibility few people could even comprehend. Yet even now, the full story remained unfinished. Critical pieces were still missing. Questions remained unanswered. And somewhere between the records they had recovered and the truths they had yet to uncover, a moment was approaching that would force everyone inside Sentinel Dynamics to confront exactly who Ethan Carter had been all along. Friday morning began with a phone call Ethan Carter almost ignored. He was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when his phone vibrated once again. Sentinel Dynamics. The same number that had appeared repeatedly throughout the week. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Then, with a quiet sigh, he answered. Hello. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Hayes. It sounded different than Ethan remembered. Less confident. More human. Ethan, please. We need to talk. Silence followed. Not angry silence. Not bitter silence. Just caution. Finally, Ethan replied. What is there to discuss? Robert took a slow breath. Everything. 2 hours later, Ethan walked back into the headquarters he thought he had left behind forever. The same glass entrance. The same polished floors. The same security desk. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different. Employees who recognized him stopped talking. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. Several simply nodded with quiet respect. Word had spread. The truth had begun to surface. Robert met him in the lobby. Thank you for coming. Ethan nodded politely. You said it was important. Together, they entered the executive conference room. Victoria Reynolds was already there. Daniel Brooks stood beside the window. Several senior leaders occupied seats around the table. The room felt unusually still. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Victoria stood. The woman who had fired him less than a week earlier looked nothing like the executive who had walked into the operations center that Friday morning. There was no authority in her posture now. No certainty. Only honesty. Ethan, she said quietly. Before anything else, I owe you an apology. The room remained silent. Victoria continued. I made a decision without understanding the facts. I saw one moment and assumed I understood the entire story. Her voice softened. I was wrong. Ethan listened without interruption. Over the past week, she continued, we reviewed everything. Your reports, your work, the systems you built, the responsibilities you carried. She paused. We finally saw what you were protecting, and we finally saw what it cost you. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the moment filled the room. Victoria looked directly at him. You deserved respect. You deserved support. And instead, you received judgment. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. Then he gave a small nod. Not because the pain disappeared. Not because the week had never happened. But because genuine accountability carries its own kind of dignity. Daniel stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. Inside were summaries from consultants, technical reviews, and executive findings. Every document reached the same conclusion. Ethan's work had prevented consequences far more serious than anyone initially realized. Systems remained stable because of defenses he had designed. Threats had been contained because of actions he had taken. The company had continued operating because he refused to stop when everyone else had gone home. Robert smiled faintly. Turns out 48 hours without sleep was not laziness. A few nervous laughs echoed through the room. Even Ethan smiled. For the first time all week, some of the tension finally broke. Then Victoria made one final offer. We want you back. The room became quiet again. Not just back, she added. We want to correct what should have happened long ago. She slid a document across the table. Ethan glanced down. It was not merely a job offer. It was recognition. A leadership role. Expanded authority. Resources he had requested for years. Support he should have received long before the crisis ever began. Ethan studied the pages carefully. Then he looked around the room. Every face reflected the same thing. Not obligation. Respect. Finally he spoke. The title matters less than the people. Victoria nodded. Understood. If I come back, nobody carries that kind of responsibility alone again. Daniel immediately answered. Agreed. Robert nodded. Absolutely. Ethan looked out the conference room window. Sunlight reflected across the city skyline. For a moment he thought about the exhaustion, the disappointment, the long nights, the unanswered warnings. Then he thought about Lily, about second chances, about the difference between revenge and redemption. Quietly, he signed. Months later, Sentinel dynamics looked different. New teams existed. Better support systems existed. Communication improved. Recognition improved. Most importantly, people paid attention. Ethan never became the loudest person in the building. He never wanted to. He simply continued doing what he had always done, solving problems, protecting others, leading with quiet dignity. One afternoon, Lily visited the office after school. She walked past employees who greeted her warmly before finding her father near a conference room. "Are you still smiling more?" she asked. Ethan laughed. "Am I?" She nodded proudly. "Definitely. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not the promotion, not the recognition, not even the apology. The real victory was knowing that kindness had survived disappointment, that dignity had survived injustice, that character had survived judgment. Sometimes the people carrying the heaviest burdens are the ones nobody notices until they are gone. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needs to announce it. If this story reminded you of someone who works hard without recognition, share their story in the comments. And if you believe quiet dignity still matters in a noisy world, consider subscribing for more stories about second chances, respect, and the extraordinary strength hidden inside ordinary people.